So in John 11, the first 16 verses of the chapter set up the story. And let me tell you what the story is, or the situation. Jesus is away from Jerusalem and Judea, and he's off, and he hears the news. A messenger comes to him and says that a man named Lazarus has died. And we're told very emphatically in the first 16 verses of our passage that Jesus loves Lazarus. Not just the way he loves everybody, but that somehow he had a special bond with Lazarus. This is his close friend. This is his dear brother. And not just Lazarus, but Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary. That Jesus is incredibly close to this family. That they are near to him in a unique way. That in very few other cases do we know of anybody who's this close to Jesus emotionally and relationally. He loves these people desperately. There is this common bond, this kinship. It's not explained where it comes from. But Jesus is of one soul with these people. So when we hear that Lazarus is sick, the natural inclination is to think, well, Jesus is going to go do something about this. Because these are his friends. These are the people that he loves. These are who he loves to spend time with. But interestingly, when Jesus hears the news, he not only does nothing about it, he actually makes clear that the reason he's doing nothing is because he's waiting for Lazarus to die. It's a stunning thought to realize that Jesus knows that this is where this is headed, and he wants to allow it to get there. And so he waits. He waits until he hears the news that Lazarus is dead, and then he goes to Bethany where they live. And the main point from the first 16 verses as the situation is set up is that Jesus wants to pick a fight with death. Not just with sickness. He wants to deal with death. And that's because his glory shines most brightly against the dark backdrop of death. And so he says, this I'm doing because I want you to see the glory of God. And so he then makes his way towards Bethany. And the rest of the story, John tells us, is a story about three people and three different approaches or experiences of death. John tells them in order: Martha, and then Mary, and then Lazarus, these three siblings who are so dear to Jesus' heart. And what we're going to see this morning as we look at this story is that with each person, Martha, and then Mary, and then Lazarus, we see a different approach to the issue of death. And more than that, with each person, we see a different aspect of who Jesus is. So let's look at the first person that Jesus interacts with. Her name is Martha, and her story is told in verses 17 to 27. Let me read them for us. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again and the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. Now, one of the strange things about this story in Martha's case that we see is that when a person has passed away, when you've lost a loved one, friends come to comfort you. You don't go to see them. It's the same way today when someone loses a loved one. They host an event at a funeral home or at a church, and there's a visitation, and we go to them. We don't ask them to come to our workplace and to see us, or to come to our house and meet with us and to tell us the news. We go to them. The same thing was true in Jesus' day. But oddly, Martha, when she hears that Jesus is coming, she gets up to leave, to go find him. He's coming to her, but she gets up to go to him. This is very unusual. But she does it because she's got a question on her mind, and it's been eating at her for a long time, probably 4 days. The question is actually stated as a statement, but you can hear the question. Listen what she says. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. The question is, where were you? The question is, I thought you were going to do something about this. Can you hear the disappointment in her voice? In the statement, you could have done something, and you didn't. I mean, after all, it's not hard to imagine that Martha expected something to happen. I mean, after all, Jesus had already healed a centurion's son. He didn't even know the guy. And it's not like he had to be in the same city. The son was in another city. And Jesus just said the word and he was healed. Jesus fed 5,000 strangers. Jesus healed a paralytic who he didn't even know and didn't even know him. And in Martha's case, well, this is our friend. He's a close friend of the family. And it's not like he didn't know. We sent him a messenger, and the messenger got there. Surely she's expecting he's going to do something. He loves us. We're kindred spirits. He loves Lazarus. This wouldn't even be a favor just for Martha. He loves the man who's sick. And Martha expects Jesus is going to do something. More than that, when the messenger gets to see Jesus, Jesus actually says in verse number 4, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through that. He's telling the messenger that. Well, what does the messenger do? He takes that back and tells Martha and Mary, I saw Jesus. Here's what he said. This sickness will not end in death. Well, what would you expect? So when Martha hears that he's coming, she is filled with disappointment. There's a question eating away at her. And she wants the answer to this question. Where were you, Lord? Where were you? Why didn't you come? Now, in her disappointment, as she begins to engage with Jesus, we see her perspective or approach to the problem of death. It's found in verses 23 and 24. Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. He's come because Jesus wants to raise Lazarus from the dead. That's the plan. So he says to her, your brother will rise again. Martha hears that and says, verse 24, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And here's Martha's approach to the problem of death. It's a theological approach. She has in her mind this all worked out about what's supposed to happen. And you know what? She's right. This is good theology. She understands that Lazarus will indeed rise again on the last day. That's the plan. And her approach to the issue of death is a theological approach. And you know, some of us approach death that way too. The death of a loved one. It's not that it's not sad. It's that we've got it figured out in our minds. This is how it works. Death is a part of life. We understand it wasn't supposed to be part of creation, but humans sinned, and because of human sin, death entered in, and it became the expected result of every person who lives. We understand that. And when a loved one dies, we process and think through these things theologically, and we think, well, it's appointed to every person to die. And that before we were alive, all the days of our lives were written in a book before one of them came to be, and that God knew this day was coming. And he planned it. It's a theological approach to death. It's not wrong. It's good theology. All of those statements I just made to you are true. problem is that it's inadequate theology in Martha's case. It's not untrue. It just isn't enough. See, in verse 25, Jesus, as he listens to her theological approach to the issue of death, doesn't say to her, "You're wrong." What he says is, "I am the resurrection and the life." What he's saying is that, Martha, what you need, your theology is good. I affirm what you think. But what you haven't taken into account is that I am the personal God of the universe. I created everything. I have resident within me life and resurrection. That's who I am. See, at the end of the day, Jesus is not leaving us in the midst of a theological system. It's not a set of truths. They're all good and they're all true. But at the point of death, he says, that's inadequate. What you need to understand is me as a person. You know, Jesus is bigger than our systems. He's not contrary to them. These theological systems help us to think about Jesus. We affirm theology. We think that's good. But Jesus is bigger than Calvinism, and Jesus is bigger than dispensationalism, and Jesus is bigger than any statements we make about him. Yes. And that's what he's coming to Martha, and he's affirming where she's at theologically in her approach to death. But he says, there's something bigger. It's me. I'm what you need. I'm the resurrection and the life. I am the God of the universe, and that changes everything. Right. Nothing she said is wrong. It just doesn't go far enough. And what Jesus is trying to do is he's meeting her in her theological approach to death and moving her to a place of trusting in the God who loves her, the personal God. Well, the second sibling that we meet is Mary. Mary's story picks up in verse 28 and goes to verse 37. Listen as I read that. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, so supposing that she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Do you hear in Mary's voice the same disappointed words that were in Martha's voice? "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Why does she say it in the exact same way that Martha does? It's because they've had this conversation. When the messenger comes back and says, "This sickness is not going to end in death," Martha and Mary get together and say, "All right, I knew it. I knew Jesus was going to do something about this." And they wait hour after hour until Lazarus gets worse and worse and worse. And then, confusingly, he dies. And Martha turns to Mary, and Mary turns to Martha and says, "If Jesus had been here, he wouldn't have died." The reason they both say it is because they're both experiencing the same disappointment. They're independent of one another, but they've talked this through. For the past 4 days, they've been wrestling with, well, why didn't he come? Where is he? The messenger got there. He got back with that message. We heard this. Where is he? But while Mary and Martha share the same level of disappointment, their approach to death is different. In Martha's case, her approach to the problem of death is theological. In Mary's case, her approach to the issue of death is emotional. It's not that Martha's not sad. It's just that when you see Mary, you see this overwhelming sense of emotion. They're there comforting her, Mary, at the house. When she comes out, when she says to Jesus, "Lord, where were you?" On Martha's lips, it sounds like a theological question. On Mary's lips, she's crying when she says it. "Lord, if you had been here, you could have done something." She's overwhelmed with emotion. She's weeping bitterly, and those who are with her are crying bitterly. This is how some of us respond to the problem of death, the death of a loved one. It's not so much that we think about death as we feel death. We feel it in our soul. Death is this blackness, this emptiness. It's this crushing of dreams. This hope that our dad and our son would be best friends as grandpa and grandson. Suddenly, when our father dies, it's gone. That hope is gone. Our dreams of wanting to spend our last years of life with our spouse that we love, who we raised our kids with, who we worked so hard to have some level of time together at the end, and then she's gone, and suddenly our hopes are crushed. What we were looking forward to. The parent who loses a child, their dreams and their thoughts for what that child could be is gone. And we don't think about it as much as we feel it. There is a finality, and we think, I wanted to tell my dad I was sorry. I wanted to hear from my mom one more thing, that good friend, I just want to talk to him one more time. And there is this wall that we cannot get through, and death comes to us and it haunts us, and we feel it inside of us. We're not thinking about death, we're feeling death. This is why for some of us, when we think about the death of a loved one, even if it's been years, we can suddenly find ourselves in tears for no real reason. It's because it's not rational. It's an emotional response to the problem of death. That's where Mary's at. And just like in Martha's case, Jesus meets Mary in her emotions. Notice what it says in verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. It literally means he was angry and grieved. So much so that in verse 35 it says, Jesus wept. This is sobbing. This is not a few tears running down his cheeks. He is sobbing. But question. Jesus knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. This has been the plan. Why is he crying? Why doesn't he have yes, he's sad for them, but why not a little smirk on his face that says, but I know this how's going to turn out. Like he's got a little gift he's got hidden behind his back that wait till they see this. That's not what he's doing. He's crying. Why? It's because he feels the pain of death. He's angry at death. Jesus hates death. And he is sad for what death does. Perhaps Jesus is crying at this moment, not just for Mary, but maybe he's remembering his own earthly father, who we think has died by this point. Maybe he is weeping about that experience. Maybe he's thinking about the fact that, yes, in Mary's case and Martha's case, they're going to get this miracle, but Lazarus will die again. Maybe he's thinking, yes, Mary and Martha get this miracle, but there are billions of people who will not get this. And they are going to be faced with that same pain and that same blackness. Maybe at this moment, Jesus was thinking about those names I read this morning from Calvary Church. And maybe he was thinking about us, who are saddened at the loss of those people. He's clearly crying for Mary and for Martha and for those friends, for the pain that they're experiencing. And here's how Jesus meets Mary where she's at. He meets her in her emotional state. Jesus is weeping. He's not faking it. He is genuinely disturbed and sorrowful, troubled in spirit at death. You see, in Martha's case, he met her in her theology, and we saw in Jesus that he is the God of the universe. With Mary, he meets her in her emotions, and we see that this God of the universe is truly human, that he's one of us, that he doesn't look at us from afar, that he sympathizes with us. This is one of the most human pictures of Jesus we have anywhere in the scriptures. He is sobbing. He is sorrowful. He is experiencing the emotions that we experience in the face of death. And here is this picture of this man, a real human as any person in this room, except more so, going through the pain of the death of a loved one. He loves Lazarus, and Lazarus has died. He loves all the people in history who have died. And here we see this outpouring of emotions from the very real human Jesus. But just like in Martha's case, Jesus doesn't just meet her in her theological approach to death. He moves her beyond that. So with Mary, he meets her in her emotional state, and he moves beyond that. It's hard to see in our English because we use the same word weep for both what Jesus is doing and what Mary is doing. But in Greek, they're two different words. In Mary's case, the word that's used for weeping has with it the idea of finality, of immobilizing emotions, of despair, of hopelessness. It's that sort of sobbing and crying when you think there's nothing that can help, there's no hope, there's nothing that can be done here. That's how Mary is crying. The word that's used for Jesus' weeping is a different word. It's still sobbing, it's still sorrowful, it's still sad. It is weeping. But it's that kind of anger, that kind of sorrow that moves you to action, that stirs something in your soul. That's why Jesus says to Mary, "Where have you laid him? Come show me." He's taking her in her emotional state and moving her to do something. Nothing else, but just simply show me where he is. And Jesus meets her in her emotions and begins to move her forward to action. That he's not going to leave her drowning and immobilized in her sadness. He will meet her there and lead her forward. Well, this takes us to our third sibling, which is Lazarus. His story is told in verses 38 to 44. It says, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Then Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." So if in Martha's case, we would characterize her approach to death as theological, and in Mary's case, we would characterize her approach to death as emotional. In Lazarus's case, his approach to death is experiential. He's dead. Martha is trying to think through death. Mary is feeling death. Lazarus is dead. He's experienced death. But just like in Martha's case, Jesus meets her in her theology, and in Mary's case, Jesus meets her in her emotions, in Lazarus's case, Jesus meets him in his death. Now, what does that mean? Jesus is not actually dead. What it means is that Lazarus' death is tied intimately with Jesus' own death. As John tells the two stories, there are a number of words that he uses only for these two stories. John 11, where Lazarus dies, and John 19 and 20, where Jesus dies. He's tied the two deaths together. More than that, Jesus' own death is on his mind. Remember in John 10, Jesus tells about the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. I lay down my life. He's thinking about the fact that he's going to give up his life. That's on his mind. And as he thinks about Lazarus' death, it's his own death that's in the back of his mind. And even more importantly than that, Jesus' death is tied to Lazarus's in a way that John makes clear. In those first 16 verses, Jesus is warned, if you go to Jerusalem, you will die. It actually turns out, according to verse 53 of chapter 11, that it is this event that causes the Jewish leaders to decide to take Jesus' life. The fact that he raised Lazarus from the dead, the fact that now everybody is saying, what can't this guy do? Let's follow him. This event is the one that causes the Jewish leaders to say, we got to kill him. We got no other hope. We tried other stuff. We tried to discredit him. We tried to trick him. It's this event that says the only hope is for us to kill him. So in many ways, Jesus is giving his life so that Lazarus can live. He knows if he goes and does this, this is what's waiting for him. And that's what I mean when I say Jesus meets Lazarus in his death. That as Jesus is interacting with Lazarus, it's Jesus' own death that he is interacting with. But just like in Martha's case, he doesn't just meet her in her theology, but moves her beyond that. And in Mary's case, he not only meets her in her emotions, but moves her beyond that. So in Lazarus' case, he meets him in death, but moves him beyond. Jesus says, Lazarus, come out. Remember in John chapter 10 when Jesus was telling us he's the good shepherd? He says the shepherd calls his sheep by what? By name. Well, here's the manifestation of that. Lazarus is his beloved. Lazarus is who he is, his best friend. Lazarus is who he has this special relationship with. When he calls him out, he calls him by name. He rescues him from death. He says, Lazarus, I know you. You are my friend. I love you. Come out. And he moves them beyond death to life. See, this is why Jesus allowed Lazarus to die. It's because the picture of who Jesus is seen more clearly and in sharper focus against the backdrop of the blackness of death. See, Jesus has come and shown himself to Martha, not to be some set of theological constructs or some set of statements, but the very God of the universe who is life and resurrection himself. And he's shown himself to Mary, not to be some distant and unfeeling God, but to be human, who sympathizes and cries and weeps with her. And he's shown himself to be God and to be human, so that he might meet Lazarus in his death and bring him out. See, this is the gospel story. That God sees the fact that our world is filled with death, that every person in this room has death as our future, that every one of us has lost somebody that we love, that we have tasted death through other people. And Jesus, who is God himself, is himself the resurrection and the life, becomes one of us so that he might sympathize with us and connect to us and relate to us so that he can call us by name out of death to life. It's the good news. It's the gospel in John chapter 11. And we see who Jesus is only when we see him against the backdrop of death. The brightness of his glory, that God, who is life, would become one of us and die to rescue us. We only see that when we think about our own deaths and when we engage with the deaths of those we love. So if you're here this morning and you've lost a loved one, perhaps one of the names I read is somebody that you know, somebody who's close to you, and you came this morning and we're not expecting to hear their name read. The point of John chapter 11 is that whether your approach to the death of your loved one has been more intellectual and theological or more emotional, that Jesus is coming to meet you in the death of that loved one and to move you beyond your theology to a relationship with the God of the universe, to move you beyond your emotions to a place where you can get back up, where you can move forward, where you're not immobilized by emotions. The person who comes to you to do that is Jesus himself, not a system of theology, not a person overwhelmed by emotions, but God and man in one person coming to comfort and to encourage you on and forward.
Amen. That's right.
And if you're here this morning and you're facing the prospect of your own death, perhaps because of health, perhaps because of age, perhaps because of circumstances, you've thought more and more about your own death. The good news is that at the moment of your death and of my death, if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, who you will find waiting for you to meet you in death is Jesus himself. And he will call you and I by name. Jim, come out. And move us from death to life. That's good news. Death is not the final enemy. Jesus is too big for death. His deity is too big, his humanity too real, and his love too powerful. Can I add one more point? We're running out of time, but I want to add this, because it broadens the application a little bit from simply being about physical death. See, in many ways, dealing with the problem of death, the reason why it's such a problem is because we're dealing with disappointment with God. Remember how disappointed Mary was? Remember how disappointed Martha was? If we're honest with ourselves, all of our experiences with death is disappointment with God. Even if the person that we love had lived a long and healthy life and a wonderful, fruitful life and was a good Christian, we do somewhere in the back of our mind think, couldn't God have given mom another 6 months? Even if we understand that in this fallen world there are drunk drivers who cut across intersections and they run into and kill children, we think to ourselves, but couldn't God have done something in our case? Didn't he have the power to stop this? And even though we may have come to grips with the fact of death, there's always something in the back of our mind said, but if we could have gotten a miracle, this wouldn't have happened. See, all death is really disappointment with God. And disappointment with God is actually broader than just physical death. It comes when we experience death of any kind. For example, when there's a divorce, it's in many ways the death of a marriage. And although we understand people get divorced, that's how this world works in some ways. In the back of our mind, we're thinking, but if God would have showed up, if God could have changed my spouse's heart, if God would have done something with my parents, this wouldn't have died. And in the back of our head, there is disappointment. If you're a high school student here and you didn't make basketball team you tried out for, that's a version of death, because it's the death of your hopes and dreams, and you had these ideas of what it'd be like to be on the basketball team and how your high school years were going to go and what it would be like to get to participate. And you may understand, hey, not everybody makes the team. Maybe the other kids were more athletic than you or whatever. But somewhere in the back of your mind, there is this level of disappointment that says, but God could have caused me to shine. He could have helped the coach see me more favorably. He could have allowed this to happen. And that death of those hopes and dreams, it's disappointment with God. Why didn't God do this? When we have a child who walks away from the Lord and makes sinful choices, we understand that that's part of living in a fallen world. But somewhere in the back of our mind that feels like our child has died. And there's this little voice that says, where was God? Couldn't he have shown up in some miraculous and powerful way? Couldn't he have kept him from becoming friends with that person? Couldn't he have not had him go to that school? Couldn't he have done? And it's disappointment with God. Where was God? God, if you had been here, my child would not have walked away. God, if you had been here, I would have made the team. God, if you would have been here, my business would have gone bankrupt. I mean, after all, that's a kind of death too, isn't it? And we understand how economics work, but in the back of our mind, we're thinking, but in our case, aren't I a child of God? Doesn't he have kind of a special relationship with me? Why didn't he have there be a sudden influx of capital? Why couldn't business have picked up? It's all disappointment with God. Whether it's physical death or these other kinds of death. What we're dealing with is disappointment with God. But the point of John 11 is that God willingly allows us to go through disappointment because his glory shines more brightly against the backdrop of death. You see, the reason we're disappointed is because we have figured out in our mind how it's supposed to work, what we want to have happen. And what we failed to take into account is that the person who is coming to us in our disappointment is the living God of the universe, who is himself truly human, who loves us beyond anything that we can possibly comprehend, who meets us in our disappointment and moves us to something better. That's what he wants for us. He has conquered not only physical death, but all kind of death. And he meets us in that. And he says, this disappointment will not end in death. That doesn't mean we won't experience the feelings of death. But what it means is that if we're a believer in Jesus, the God of the universe, who is himself one of us, will meet us in that disappointment and take us to something beyond what we can possibly imagine. That's why Ephesians has these words. Now unto him who's able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or even imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus, both now and forever. Amen.